Just like Jefferson, Jackson opposed the bank. In fact, for many of the same reasons. He felt it only benefited the rich, it was unconstitutional, and etc. Jackson also felt that the bank was inconsistent in the way it gave loans to farmers. Some people they would say yes, some people they'd say no, and he didn't like the bank president, Nicholas Biddle.
Jackson wasn't alone in his dislike of the bank. However, in the Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court declared that the national bank was legal. By establishing this ruling, the Supreme Court was actually overruling Maryland and therefore making a ruling against state rights.
So here you should have Nicholas Biddle, and then down here you should have the states. The National Republicans and Henry Clay had a plan to save the bank and weaken Jackson. They wanted Nicholas Biddle to apply early for the renewal of the bank charter or contract. They knew that Jackson would veto the bank bill. They hoped this would anger Americans whom they believed supported and liked the bank. This anger then would keep Americans from voting for Jackson in the upcoming election of 1832.
However, they were extremely wrong. You see, the bank was responsible for regulating the number of loans it made, so not everyone got a loan, mostly commoners, those who supported Jackson. The bank had other functions as well, printing money and holding the government's tax money. Although not everyone disliked everything the bank did, they did really like and respect Jackson and supported his decisions.
Here you should have Jackson, and they believed Americans liked the bank. Okay, well, that was fun. The death of the bank. Jackson vetoes the bank. Jackson does exactly what the Republicans expect him to do. He vetoes the bank bill and claims it's unconstitutional. By declaring the bank unconstitutional, Jackson is actually establishing a new presidential power, the right to ignore the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court has already declared the bank legal.
However, as we have already stated, the Republicans were completely wrong about American support. They completely supported Jackson's veto of the bank and demonstrated that support by re-electing him in 1832.
Jackson decided to take further action by removing all federal tax money from the national bank and deposit it instead into hand-picked state banks that he liked. These special banks were referred to as pet banks. He also orders all land purchases to be made with gold.
As much as Americans supported Jackson now and supported his decision to veto the bank, they will feel the impact in a matter of years. Jackson's decision will lead America to a financial and economic crisis. More on this later.
Okay, here you should have vetoes the bank, Americans support Jackson, pet banks, and gold. Jackson takes on the Native Americans. Another travesty of Jackson's presidency dealt with the Native Americans. As Americans expanded west to achieve manifest destiny, more and more Native Americans were forced off their land. Americans used the excuse that Native Americans were not making good use of their land. In Georgia, Americans wanted to use the land for cotton farming and gold that had actually been discovered.
So, to help out these zealous settlers, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This forced all natives to pick up their homesteads and move west to the Mississippi. Most of these Native Americans ended up in the Oklahoma Territory. Some of these Native Americans had even tried to adapt to the white men's ways, sending their kids to school and even joining local churches.
It didn't matter. All Native Americans were forced to abandon their lands and move west, and Andrew Jackson supported this Indian Removal Act. Here you should have all natives must move west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokees were one such group that had tried to adopt white culture. In fact, they decided to sue for the right to the land. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokees in Worcester versus Georgia. Once again, Jackson decides to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. Instead, he supports states' rights and supports Georgia.
He sent in the army to force out the Cherokee. This horrendous event became known as the Trail of Tears. Over a quarter of the Cherokees will lose their life on this 800-mile-long journey. The army did not have enough supplies to feed the Cherokee, nor did they allow the Cherokee time along the trail to hunt. This has to be one of our darkest hours as Americans. Look at these two paintings. From which point of view do you believe each painting was created? Which do you believe is the most accurate depiction?
Here you should have gold. Here, the Cherokee. And this, the Trail of Tears. Natives from all over America were impacted by the Indian Removal Act. The Cherokees weren't the only to resist removal. The Seminoles in Florida put up quite a fight under the leadership of Osceola. The U.S. Army was sent in to assist with the removal. After 1,500 Army casualties and millions spent by Congress, the Seminoles were left alone. What a victory for the Native Americans. And here you should have Florida. Analyze this political cartoon by answering the questions on the slide. When you're ready, we will summarize the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Because just like his predecessors, Jackson will step down after 2 terms, even though with his popularity, he could have won a 3rd term.
Jackson definitely strengthened the power of the presidency. He was also responsible for thousands of deaths. His action with the bank will contribute to an economic depression. I would definitely say he's an interesting character who definitely made an impact on our history.
Here you should have strengthened the power of the presidency, responsible for thousands of deaths, and his actions led to an economic depression. Okay. Martin Van Buren became vice president under Jackson when Calhoun stepped down. He ran for president in 1836 and won probably because of his association with Jackson. However, an economic depression, the Panic of 1837, hit during his presidency. This was in major part due to Jackson's closing of the National Bank. Since no one was regulating loans, everyone was granted money from the bank.
However, not everyone paid back their loans. These state banks then began to print more paper money to continue the demand. However, they can't just print paper money and expect everything to be okay. Back in this time, gold backed the dollar.
Called specie.
So if you wanted to, you could take in your paper money to a bank and exchange it for gold. But as more and more paper money was printed, it began to lose value.
And once Jackson declared all land purchases to be made with gold, many people rushed to the banks to switch their paper money with gold. But the banks didn't have enough gold to give all the people, and they began to close their doors.
When money loses its value, it's called inflation. Let's give you an example to understand how inflation impacts people. Let's say a loaf of bread costs 5 cents. During the Panic of 1837, that same loaf of bread might cost $5. This is an extreme example, but prices did increase dramatically. I'm sure you've heard your parents or grandparents talk about back in my day, a candy bar only cost 25 cents.
This was a difficult time for our country. It won't be the worst depression our country will face, but it wasn't easy for Americans to survive.
I just want to say I'm a little offended because she said back in your grandparents' day, back in my day, candy bars cost 25 cents.
Let's review the blanks real quick. Here, this is Jackson closed the National Bank. Here, decreased, and that equals inflation. Not only did Jackson's vetoing the bank cause the Panic of 1837, but also the failing cotton industry. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 increased the production of cotton so much that the market was flooded. Too much cotton caused the price of cotton to drop It's all called supply and demand. Many farmers had loans to the banks for more land and to purchase these fantastic cotton gins. However, when the price of cotton dropped, these farmers were unable to pay back their loans. This caused more banks to close.
This economic depression lasted for 3 years, and Martin Van Buren will be blamed for the disaster. Who should really be blamed? Andrew Jackson, that's who. However, the people loved Andrew Jackson, who knows why, and wouldn't dare blame him for these difficult times. Your blank? Last for 3 years, Martin Van Buren.
This economic depression will be fresh on voters' minds in the election of 1840. The National Republicans will become the Whig Party and choose William Henry Harrison and John Tyler for their candidates. Martin Van Buren will once again represent the Democrats.
This becomes quite the attack campaign. Whigs as well as all Americans blame Van Buren for the depression. In fact, they nicknamed him Martin Van Ruin. So sad. And remember, Jackson was truly to blame.
The Whigs will try to portray Harrison as a common man who grew up in a log cabin. In fact, the campaign will be called the Log Cabin Campaign. They also try to portray him as a war hero with their slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Remember the Battle of Tippecanoe, where Harrison defeats Tecumseh and the Native Americans? Doesn't this sound familiar? Yes, this was exactly modeled after Andrew Jackson.
However, Harrison was not born in a log cabin, nor was he poor, and he wasn't nearly the same caliber of a war hero as Jackson. Harrison easily wins the election. The Whigs have big plans for Harrison's presidency. They wanted to bring back high tariffs, work on internal improvements like new roads, canals, railroads, and of course, bring back the National Bank.
Your blanks, it should be the Whig Party, which is W-H-I-G. Democrats, Van Buren. And down here, makes him a war hero. And then your last one, bring back the bank.
Here you can see how easily Harrison defeated Martin Van Ruin in the election of 1840.
Once again, we can cover an entire presidency in one slide. You see, Harrison will not make it very long as president. He actually holds two records in our history. One, for the longest inaugural speech in our history that was given out in the cold rain. This probably assisted him with his second record. He served the shortest term as president. Harrison ends up dying within 1 month of his inauguration. How sad.
Tyler, the vice president, will become the president, and he was actually just a recent convert from Democrats to the Whigs. He actually didn't agree with many of the Whigs' policies. The Democrats will easily take back the presidency in the next election.
And that ends your notes.